All right, let's talk about some winery wastewater management. A very exciting topic, and I used a very appropriate color for the background of the slides. So, things we need to talk about. This lecture has been around since back 2010, 2011, and I noticed when I was living in Australia that they were so much more concerned with winery wastewater than we were here. And I've just noticed that Australia is about a decade ahead of the United States on just about everything in terms of sustainability. They've just been put into drought situations so much ahead of us, and they're just a little bit more proactive in taking care of things. So I thought it was a really good idea to start talking about these things. And sure enough, over the years, there have been changes to the laws, and people are getting a lot more conscious about winery wastewater here in the US. And now there's actually a permitting process you have to go through if you want to have a winery of any specific size in Washington, and you'll have to have an approved winery wastewater treatment plant. So we'll talk about how those look if you aren't attached to the city sewer. So we're going to talk about our byproducts, what's in our typical winery wastewater stream, how we classify winery wastewater, and then how are we going to deal with that discharge. So the three R's of sustainability is reduce, reuse, and recycle. Keep that in mind. And things have changed a whole lot since the 1960s. And I remember one of my jobs when I was a kid was to take all the press wash. My parents, my grandparents, and both my dad were all in the printing industry, and they had a 50-gallon drum of used press wash. So this was basically paint thinner and old ink. And he just said, my grandpa said, you need to go empty that drum, and they'd pay me to do that. And I get a coffee can, which is probably about 2 or 3 liters at a time, and pour it down the drain. And we pour it down the drain with hot water to make sure it didn't solidify. And we just wanted to dilute it enough so it wouldn't hurt the wastewater treatment plant. That was how things were back then. I think we're a little bit different now. So here's where we are more modern today, and this is what would look like if you were to be attached to a sewage treatment plant. So many of us who have homes, we're close to the city, and this is true of college cellars as well, that we have a setup that we have our winery wastewater travel down to a treatment plant. And these are the things that would go in that. You can read it as good as I can. But the idea here is to look at those particular terms. And really the goal with this whole thing is to get you to understand some really broad concepts about winery wastewater, but this isn't going to get, terribly detailed. So really, why does this matter to the wine industry? I mean, really, why? We've got beautiful grapevines and horses just taking care of everything. We all live in little hobbit houses with little vines planted outside. And, we've done a really good job of greenwashing the wine industry. And so we keep doing these things like saying, save water, drink wine, save water, drink wine, save water, drink wine, save water, drink wine. Oh, conserve water, drink wine. There comes the Bejeweled shirt. You're in trouble when that walks in the tasting room. So, but let's talk about the reality. This is the reality. You guys know it. You've seen it. And, wineries generate a lot of waste byproducts. And the cool thing is we can reuse a lot of them. We're going to talk about that. Especially there's a video in here for Tareq Technologies. Click on it and watch it and see what they do with it. It's amazing. And I'm amazed that we don't have a plant here that does that. So we do have a lot of sludge and junk. So we've got leftover diatomaceous earth leaves. We've got tartrates. We've got yeast leaves. We've got grape skins. But these are all usable things that we can, down the line, convert into other byproducts that are valuable for the wine industry. Let's talk about the reality of how much water it takes. Depending on the vineyard, it takes between 120 and 250 gallons of water to make 1 gallon of wine. So that idea of conserve water, drink wine doesn't really hold. Most of it is used in irrigation and growing. The lowest I've heard of is 2.5 gallons of winery wastewater to produce 1 gallon of wine. So if you were dry growing and you did everything perfectly and you cleaned perfectly in the winery, you could get your wastewater down to 1 gallon of wine. 2.5 gallons of wastewater for 1 gallon of wine. The green standard is anything less than 3 gallons of winery wastewater for each gallon of wine. However, for us at College Cellars, we take about 12 to 15 gallons. And primarily the reason we're at that number is just economies of scale. We just have to wash so much more, so many small tanks. It requires a vast amount more water to clean with than in a larger winery. So let's think about a winery's, typical PR concerns. We want to have an image. We hear about sustainability, looking good. We also want to conserve water. Water's expensive. Even if you're pumping it out of the ground, you got to pay for the pump. And then we also want to concern ourselves with water quality and realize that we're only temporary stewards of the land. The land was here well before us. It'll be here well after us. And we want to leave it in every bit as good a condition, if not better, if possible, than what we inherited as. So let's talk about some concerns in winery wastewater. They smell. Winery wastewater stinks. And we want to talk about the idea of biochemical oxygen demand or biological oxygen demand, BOD. Our total solids that we have, how much junk do we have going down the drain? Do we need to acid or base adjust the winery wastewater stream? Because sometimes we want to make sure that it's as close to pH neutral as possible so we don't shock the system if we are hooked to a dedicated, delegated sewer treatment plant. Then we have a lot of high nutrients. We've got nitrogen and phosphorus that are going down the drain, and yeast are loaded with all kinds of stuff. And then also we've got salinity issues because we're using sodium percarbonate or sodium hydroxide to clean with. And then of course we always have these issues of trihalomethanes that are produced by all the other microbes that come along and eat up our lovely leftover yeast leaves. So we've always got to be concerned about those things. So here's some compounds that we have to worry about. We've got caustic soda and sodium hydroxide. They're full of sodium. That becomes an issue, and we'll talk about that a little later on. Then we've got our grape byproducts. We've got our acids, citric, tartaric, malic, anything other than that. There's all these things that we're putting down the drain, and why are they a problem? And this is the idea of biochemical oxygen demand. So not that this really matters and you don't need to, we aren't going to get into detail and we're not going to go measure BOD, but the idea here is how it's a method of determining how much oxygen it's going to take for a little aerobic bacteria to eat up all the stuff we're sending down the drain. Okay. And it's important to differentiate this idea from dissolved oxygen because you can kind of get caught up in that realm. But biochemical oxygen demand is just how much oxygen does it take to clean up some winery wastewater so that all of the sugars and acids and nitrogens and nitrates and everything else are all converted into a nutrient, a non-nutrient rich environment. So getting rid of all of the nutrients. And so the reason why we're going to talk about this is winery wastewater is really high in BOD because of the sugars, the alcohols, acids, and all these things are something that is going to have to get consumed before we put it out back into a water stream, because it's going to have to go back into a river or a lake, or get maybe irrigated with. And the last thing you want to do is irrigate with water that can possibly go on your vineyard and start growing all kinds of nasty things. So we want to make sure all those things are used up. So why does BOD matter? Well, as the BOD of the wastewater stream increases, the available oxygen decreases. So the thing is that as we have more and more BOD in water, it's going to, we're putting more things with high BOD into water. The microorganisms that are growing in that water are going to consume all of the oxygen out. So what happens is when you put high BOD liquid into good quality water, what happens is it starts sucking up the oxygen. There's all these little microorganisms that are sucking up oxygen. So as they do that, we see our dissolved oxygens drop. And as soon as we get below around 4 to 4.5 milligrams a liter of dissolved oxygen, marine life dies. And it is not unusual in high runoff times. Just the fertilizers from local crops can get into Mill Creek, and Mill Creek can end up in that 4.5 to 5 range on a pretty regular basis. And that's part of the reason they have those little tumblers is to get oxygen back into the water. It's also to slow down the velocity of the water so we don't have a flooding event. But at the same time, the idea is here, just the runoff from our local area can do that. Imagine how different winery wastewater is. And here's the reason why we worry about it. Is you get these algal blooms and algae will grow. And when that happens, it sucks up all the air. And these are pictures from one of them is in the US, but the big one here is in China. And China is a lot less regulated than the United States is in many ways. but they're have major problems with algal blooms, and then your fish all die. And I thought this was an amazing picture of a kid just going for a swim in some algae, because that's okay. But yeah, we used to see that here in the US, and I remember growing up with lakes and things that we saw this, and now you don't see it anymore because we're doing a much better job in the United States of cleaning up our wastewater stream. And that's why we've got to be better about this. So, how does winery wastewater stack up? So, let's go through this in a reasonable way. Most pristine rivers will have a 5-day turnaround of less than 1 milligram per liter. Now, that's not the DO in the water. That's just how much it would take to clean up whatever's growing in that pristine lake or pond. So when you hop in a mountain lake and you notice you can see all the way down to your toes, that's pristine because there's no microorganisms really living in it. It's super clean water. When we start to get a little bit of pollution into some sort of a river or things like that, we start to get to that 2 to 8 milligrams a liter. So that's going to take 2 to 8 milligrams a liter of dissolved oxygen to have the microorganisms grow enough to clean it up. Municipal sewage that's been treated by a 3-stage process will have about 20 milligrams a liter or less. So getting down to 20 milligrams a liter is really the gold standard to be able to put it back into a lake or a stream, so we won't have an issue with an algal bloom or some sort of microbial growth that will suck the oxygen out of the water and then hurt the life of the marine life. Now, untreated sewage averages around 600 milligrams a liter in Europe and is as low as 200 milligrams a liter in the US. And so this is really interesting. Our sewage in the U.S. is much, much lower because we bathe a lot more often. We bathe 2 to 3 times as often as general Europeans. Now, it's not all countries. I'm sure some are very different, but they have much more concentrated sewage than we do because they're not using as much water as we are. So you can see that the Americans really like to use their water and their high flush capacity toilets, which are very different from other places. So again, we've been spoiled for a long time, but we've got to start recognizing that we need to do a better job of conserving water. So in the off season, a winery is somewhere between 1 and 2,000 milligrams a liter of BOD. During harvest, 10 to 20,000 milligrams a liter is not unusual. So realize we are producing a huge amount more BOD than a household. But what's interesting though is a winery the size of college cellars actually uses less water than a typical household does in a year. You repeat that. Winery the size of college cellars, 2 to 3,000 cases, uses less water than a typical household does because we aren't taking showers every day. We're not, continually flushing toilets, and that's a household of 4 in the U.S. So, but the BOD coming out from our facilities is much higher. So this is why we need to be able to have our water coming out so that it can get into the sewage treatment plant and be effectively processed. And we don't want to just dump wine down the drain, because if we do that, then we risk sending too high a BOD to the wastewater treatment plant, and it'll kill it. Also, the same it needs to be said for when you're on your own system at a winery. You've got to make sure you dole it out in a very even rate so that you don't end up killing your system or damaging your system. So this is why wineries need to treat their wastewater. Oh yeah, and in California, you got to be below 40 milligrams a liter for using for irrigation. And the primary reason for that is if you put out something above 40 milligrams a liter, it's not necessarily going to be terrible for your grapevines. However, it will smell. And when you irrigate a vineyard with 50 to 60 milligram a liter BOD wastewater, your vineyard will smell like a sewage treatment plant. Although your vines may be happy, it is not exactly ideal for the aroma around your vineyard. So we want to talk about reduction and the things we can do. We'll talk about gross lees filtration and lees removal. And we've talked about lees filters in our filtration talk. So let's just go ahead and move into that. I want to do a little cost benefit analysis. This is like Pete and repeat sitting on a fence. But let's just do some numbers here. And if we buy a lees filter plate and frame, one that costs $10,000, and we can slow that down and reduce our losses, we can save around a winery, again, about the size of college cellars, could save around 2,250 gallons per year. And then if we recover that and we were able to bulk it out for $10 a gallon, we'd get a return on investment for 1 year. And let's say we were actually able to market and sell it somehow to at $10 a bottle, and we were $3 a bottle into it, like our Scholarship Light, then we'd find about $40,000 in found wine, provided that you could sell it. So there are reasons for lees filtration. This is that idea of reducing your wastewater stream and then using it for something else. And I think we can get better at this. We've been working on it a little bit, doing some extra settling and trying to rack off some of our lees to do a little better job. There's also a new little tangential centrifuge that's out there by Hayes Filters. It's about 25 grand, but might be one of those things that we'll look into as we move forward. Again, the most common way of treating BOD is with an aerated lagoon. You put the high BOD water in it and you pump oxygen into it. You can either use a filter or fountain or injectors or a whole bunch of different ways, but the idea here is that we inject oxygen, we encourage the growth of those aerobic microorganisms, and they will consume our BOD for us. And then once we get there, we can reuse it. Once it's cleaned up, we get it below that 40 milligram a liter threshold, and then we can irrigate with it. And in Australia, for each megaliter, each million liters of recycled water saves them between $30,000 and $50,000 a year. So very real reasons in Australia, where water is very expensive, to save your wastewater. So that's great, but that doesn't solve all of our problems because we still have to deal with solids. So what are our grape and wine solvents? We've got a combination of grape skins, seeds, stems, and fermentation byproducts, and of course, finding agent, proteins, bentonite, inorganic matter, things like that. There's a whole bunch of things in the bottom of a tank. So we want to get our solids removal out, and generally we have a couple of ways of doing that, and we'll talk about sludge digesters and centrifuges here. So this is a picture from the wastewater treatment plant at Yalumba. So if you take a look over to the side of where the green tanks are, that's Yalumba in Australia. But if you look at that, you've got three things that you can take a peek at. Number one, we've got the big blue pond, which is sort of the clean water. Then if you look at the kind of greenish pond, that's their kind of high, the two greenish ponds. So you've got the one that's closer to the building, that's really green, and then a little bit more green. Those are the places where there's the high BOD wastewater is being digested. But then there's another thing that looks like a little brown tent. And that little brown tent is where they do anaerobic digestion. And that's what I want to talk about, where they do really heavy solids and they have things in there that are microorganisms are growing in there, and it smells terrible in there. But then what they do is they actually harvest the gas. And Tareq Technologies also has this same thing, and there's a video posted up for them, and you need to go watch it. But they harvest the gas, the methane gas off of it, and use it to fire their stills to make grape spirits. So just a way, again, of using everything you have to make some clean winery wastewater. Take your winery wastewater and utilize those solids. So sludge is the highest BOD of the wastewater stream. Usually it's settled out in a primary sedimentation tank, and then after that, we might want to further settle it out and clean it up. So let's talk about the three ways we do that. So this is an anaerobic digester. It's an airtight tank, usually a covered lagoon. And the sludge is prepared, pumped in, and then after that, it's broken down by microorganisms, a whole bunch of them, to where we have water, where we're taking the clean water out, and then we're harvesting the methane and carbon dioxide and using that for a variety of different things. And interestingly enough, right now there's actually a CO2 shortage because we aren't using as much, not fermenting as much, and we're not capturing as much because of the amount of business that's kind of down right this minute, which is fascinating. So this is NPEC in the Barossa, and this is the winery wastewater treatment plant that's at Tareq Technologies in that video. And so most wineries in the Barossa, they actually capture their water in tanks, their wastewater, then it's pumped out and they take it down to this place in the Barossa where they go ahead and treat the winery wastewater. So so all the wineries get together, they send all their stuff to Tareq. So all of their grape skins go to Tareq, and Tareq takes those grape skins and then they break them down into the things in the video. Then they have the wastewater treatment. They process their wastewater. And then in the process of their wastewater, they, this is one of the coolest tours I went on. They have this biogas generator, and they take the biogas that they generate from the leftover wastewater to fire the stills that take the pomace and they make Grape out of it, make it into grape spirits, and they sell it back to the wineries. So the wineries pay to have their wastewater broken down by them. They utilize the leftover byproducts of the wastewater stream to make biogas to distill the stems and skins that the wineries pay to have hauled off and dealt with by Tareq. And then Tareq sells you the spirits back, the enological tannins, and all of the other pieces of the grape, and eventually turns the rest into cattle feed. So, and they're selling all of it. So they're getting paid to take the stuff, they're getting paid to process the stuff, and then they're selling you the products back. It is sheer genius. Another thing we can do is called activated sludge. And this is where they shove it into an aeration tank. It's almost the equivalent of almost like flotation, but sort of the opposite, where you're injecting water, you're creating an environment that's really, really rich in microorganisms, and then you send it to a clarifier, and the sludge settles out, and then you take out the treated water. And this is very commonly done, kind of like a first stage settling, and before it goes off to your pond to get rid of that, that 20, 30, 40,000 BOD sludge, which is basically like yeast leaves and everything else, getting them to fully convert, and then taking the water off that after it settles out. But it's not the coolest new thing, because there is a new technology that I really want to talk about. And there's a video on the linked up here, and this is called BioFilter, and I think these guys have got the coolest thing. I think they're based out of Chile originally. But what they do is they compost it with red wiggler worms, so vermicast. So you basically pump your high BOD wastewater with full of sludge and everything else onto this medium full of red wigglers, and they eat it. And they consume the BOD. They're happy as a clam to do it. They love every minute of it. And then you end up with really clean wastewater on the other side. Fascinating. So go ahead and take a look at that video I put up, but research them. They're a really neat company. I think they've got a lot of potential, and I think this is going to be a really big deal for Washington. So I want to talk about some of the bacteria here, and I'll go ahead and click up the link to this. It's just sort of fun. But there's all types of bacteria. There are hundreds of them, and so thousands of them. And one of my friends who has his master's in enology went on to become a wastewater treatment plant, because he's like, dude, it's so boring making wine. You only work with like 5 or 6 different kinds of bacteria. I work with like 3,000. So, and so he gets to sit around in his microscope all day and see what's growing in his wastewater. And he loves it. So for a microbiome geek, wastewater is a lot more fun than wine, because we only work with a couple of bacteria. The other thing we can do to reduce solids is just a centrifuge. So many big wineries centrifuge all their wastewater on the way out. And the centrifuge is really good at getting rid of the sludge. And then you take that sludge and you can either compost it or send it to the landfill. And we see more and more people composting their wastewater, which is really neat. Here's a wonderful picture of a winery I visited where this is the sludge that came out of the bottom of the tank. So this is actually after it sat in a tank for a while, and converted for a bit, this is all the sludge that they filtered off. Isn't that a lovely color? And the other things that we can do too, which always is fascinating for me, is that, reuse your solids. And, we hear about people saying glutathione rich this and that and all yeast leaves and everything else. It's amazing to me, all the things in the wine industry that we buy, like Go Firm and Superfood and all this stuff. And they're basically just dead yeast. And so they're taking yeast and selling them back to you. So if you can find ways to take that, isolate it, and reuse it and resell it, you've got a great opportunity to make a little bit of money. The other things that we can do in terms of recycling is many wineries save their tartrates and they grind them and reuse them for the contact process. Grape solids can be composted and returned to the vineyard. And then grape pomace, we can do a lot of things where we can distill it in a pomace still and make grappa. We can use for color extraction, we can pull that out and make the equivalent of mega purple. And then the remaining tartaric acid could also be extracted and settled. So there's a lot of things that we can do. And this is what that video from Tareq will show you, all the things that they can do with winery waste. The only problem is we have one last thing. After we get everything cleaned up, we have a salinity issue, because winery wastewater, because we're using sodium hydroxide, we've got to deal with it. And I'm sure you guys remember this from Matt Williams's classes, but we have salinity to deal with. And the reason why we care about that is it really can destroy our soil. So if we're going to be using winery wastewater to irrigate again, we've got to be very, very, very aware of the consequences for our soil. It can cause all sorts of aggregation and can really mess up cation exchange to the roots. So basically, we want to be really careful when we do that. So if we are processing our winery wastewater to clean, we have to consider using reverse osmosis. And basically, it's a type of cross-flow filtration that happens at high pressure, but we've got to get that salt out of there if we're approaching dangerous levels for irrigation in the vineyard. So the thing is that you probably would rotate between using your winery wastewater and then using another water source that isn't high in salinity to drive that salt down if you didn't want to go all the way through reverse osmosis. But definitely something to pay attention to, be aware of, because you don't want to wreck your vineyard. And so here's a quick review if we ever had a quiz on this, but we're probably not. So, well, actually, that's not true. We probably will have a couple questions in here, but it's not like you're not going to be able to go back and look at the video. So, cheers.